5:30. I don't know if there are more out there yet to come on, but it's a little after 5:30, so I'm going to go ahead and call this first annual, who knows when, if ever again, virtual chapter meeting. Sorry that the caterer could not show up and accommodate everybody tonight. So first item on the agenda is, I don't know about a roll call. I guess people can see who's on. At least we were able to. I guess if you want to say hello, use the chat feature. We have anybody here tonight that is not an appraiser or a member of the Seattle chapter who would be considered a guest, that they'd like to introduce themselves, or somebody would like to introduce the guest they asked invited to join? And you'll have to unmute if you want to chime in. So no guests tonight. You have an agenda. Here it is. It's up on your screen right now. We'll need a motion and a second from the floor to approve the agenda for tonight's meeting.
So moved.
Mel Morgan moves. Do we have a second? Come on, John, chime in there. John
Henderson, second.
John Kilpatrick waved his hand. I'll acknowledge him as the second on this. Do we have any amendments or edits to the agenda that people think should be on there tonight?
Move to approve the minutes?
That's coming up next. I'm first approving the
Oh,
agenda.
that's right. We haven't voted yet. Sorry.
Yeah. You got to do the Robert's Rules of Order here.
Thank you.
I've been trained in that since high school, Mel. All right, those all in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, carries. Now, Mel, we will move to approve the minutes of the January meeting that we held. Mel moves. We have a second.
Second.
John seconded. Is David Hunnicutt on here taking minutes?
I'm taking minutes, Dan.
Thank you, DeAnn. Dave, that's one of David's functions as secretary of the chapter. He should be here tonight doing that, but I guess he's not on tonight. Okay, so the meeting minutes from the January 15th meeting, which was our great snowbound meeting at the WAC, although we did have 24 members present, which was great. Those were the hardy people who weren't too concerned, or they had four-wheel vehicles. Any amendments to the minutes?
Was there something I heard about standby and drinks at all the meetings?
We won't put that in the official minutes record. So. All right, all in favor of approving the minutes from the January chapter meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carries. All right, back onto our agenda here. We're going to have a presentation, a brief presentation here or so from Brian O'Connor. And Brian, we appreciate you stepping up to the plate once again. Brian's got a little bit current information about the greater Puget Sound, Seattle area apartment market. And he has titled it as Equilibrium Disrupted, which is a very interesting title. It should tell you he's got some interesting news to share with us. So, Brian, we're going to turn it over to you now and let you go through on your slide presentation, which I hope everything will fit okay on the screen and we can see it. Brian, you got it? You got it figured out here? DeAnn, are you working with him on that? Can you help him?
He just needs to unmute. I think he's looking for it.
Oh,
there he is. There you go.
Okay. DeAnn, can you put it up, put the PowerPoint up? Okay.
Do you not see the PowerPoint?
Oh, there it is. It's kind of small. Yeah. Okay. So before I get too deep into this, I'm going to tell you kind of what happened. We do this study routinely twice a year. I've been doing it for like 30 something years. So one we do in the winter time and one we do in the summer. Well, this last one we did in the winter, we collected all the data, sort of December, January, wrote it and figured it all out. I had it all done and written up by the first week of March. And the market was finally in equilibrium after years and years of being undersupplied. And, and this, it was a great market. And then, the shelf life of that study lasted about a week and a half to 2 weeks, right? And then it was over. I had to rewrite it. So come about April, May, we had to kind of patch it up the best we could. I couldn't totally redo it. And then we redid the whole thing in June, July, and August. So that's what you're going to see now, is you're going to see the whole study here all new. And that's why it's equilibrium disrupted, because the first time we looked at this only 6 months or 7 months ago, the market was in really perfect equilibrium. Vacancy rates were about 3.7, supply and demand were equal, rents were going up at like 3-4%. It was that Goldilocks moment. And then it wasn't. So if you would go to the next slide. Okay, this slide, it looks confusing and like there's a lot going on, but it's actually pretty simple. The green line is historical net apartment demand, real demand, the change in occupied units. The blue line with the shaded area underneath it is ownership, being single family and condo, new. This is all new, marginal new demand. So you can see this pattern. It goes back to 1982. It probably spans, for us older guys, this is pretty much our whole career on this page right here. And you can see how you can actually see the ownership bubble there in the middle. You can see the big apartment market in the 80s, and then how it's cycled through to the end. And the interesting part over here is in the shaded, you can see the apartment demand dropped down in 2020. You can see the number there of 1,781 units. That's what we expect the net apartment demand to be for this year, when last year it was like 8,000 or 9,000. So radical shift. But then we expect it to bounce back up. You can see ownership we expect to continue on more or less a gentle slope, and then apartment demand should go up. The shaded area is the share of ownership that's condo. So you can kind of see how much the condo how much its share of the overall was. Next slide. Okay, this one, sort of the basis here, you can see historical net demand. Again, this is measured by the change in occupancy. So it is measured by how many new units got leased plus the change due to vacancy. And sometimes vacancy goes down, so it actually adds to the net demand. And sometimes vacancy goes up, that subtracts from whatever new units were leased. Now the 2020 number here, you can see, is just the January through June number. The new supply here, and that's again net demand. The new supply are the units that came on, and actually those units were leased. So in January and February, we thought we were going to have about 8,000 new units, and this is in the King Snohomish market. So when we saw that we actually leased 3,600, at first we were like pretty impressed, given all the troubles in the economy in the spring with the lockdown and such. We thought that was pretty decent. Many times that number in the first 6 months can be 6,000 units. So we knew it was off, but it was better than maybe I expected. The difference came between the change in vacancy. You can see vacancy went up from 3.7 to 4.9. So we leased about 3,600 new units, but we gave some of that back because vacancy went up. Next slide. So these are sort of the drivers here. You at the top half is all history. The bottom half is forecast. So if you look at the new jobs column, you can see that pattern there, 50, 40, 38, 40,000. Okay, and look at the new population where we were in the 60s and 50s. Now, you go down to the forecast and you get this 2020 new jobs. The employment forecast, I rely on the economist that does the economic forecaster up in Bellingham, McCaffrey, and he called for 153,000 jobs. I think his numbers came out in like May. And if you actually look at the June numbers, and because June is the middle of the year and jobs are measured annual average to annual average, so that job loss is actually verified by our June numbers. So I have a lot of confidence in that we're going to lose on an average basis, we're going to lose 153,000 jobs. What I found more encouraging is the rebound in 21 and 22, where we're looking at job growth 65,000 and 69,000. And again, compare that to the new job growth that we had in 16, 17, and 18. And you can see that's extremely robust job growth. But of course, a lot of it is just the rebound of jobs when the expectation is the restaurants will open back up and theaters and the normal activity starts coming back. A lot of those jobs will come back. So some of that is new jobs, and a lot of it is a rebound. And then he's calling for that employment growth to kind of retreat a little bit in 23, and then rebound and start getting a bit more normal in the later years. But all that job growth really does, and it's vitally important, but when we model this out, job growth is really the variable that solves for net migration. Because what really we're looking for here is population growth and how many new households we're going to have. So we look at the job growth to feed net migration. If we don't have any net migration at all, our population growth will probably be around 15,000, because that's the natural increase number. That's the births minus deaths. So I went back 2009 to look at what did we do for population growth in 2009 and 10, and it was about 15,000. So where I differ or disagree with the economist is in his forecast of new persons. The 2020 number, and this is something else you have to kind of tune into to really understand these numbers. These are as April 1st, because that's when the Washington State does population as April 1st, because that's the US Census date. But if you look at the delta from April 1st to April 1st, so they come out and go, oh, April 1st of 2020, we grew by 46,000 people. That part of is not really a forecast. That's known. That's already been published. But it really represents what happened the year before, right? Because it's from April 1st of 19 to the April 1st of 2020. So there's the population and official population numbers are not exactly in sync with the employment numbers. So if you look at the new persons in 21, it's 17,000. That's really what's happening now. Okay, but it'll show up by next April 1st. So I'm putting the population numbers in according to the official April 1st date, but we have to realize what's going on here, and it really represents most of the year before. Where I differed from the economist is in his 2021 number, he said population was going to grow to 34,000. I tried to use that. I tried to incorporate that. It made no sense to me. It was pumping up households and apartment demand way above what we're experiencing now. I knew something was wrong. So I went back and looked at, like I said, in 09 and 10, and natural increase being around 15,000, I brought that number down to 17. So that's, most of these number here are the economist's numbers, except for that 17, that's my number. So once we have the new persons, we convert that into new households, the far right column, because then we look at, well, how many new households we're going to have, and how many of those households are likely to go into standard apartments. All right, we call that the marginal household tenure rate. And if you look back and looked at that very first graph that goes back to the 80s, you would find that in the apartment boom of the late 80s, the marginal household tenure rate was around 55%, meaning 55% of all new households were choosing an apartment. Through the 90s, that number came down, and then came down gently, and then it bumped up a little bit with the dot-com thing that we had in 98, 99, and then the recession, and then in the 2000s, they brought the interest rates down so low, and we had the bubble, that marginal household tenure rate that was 55% in 88 or 89, by 2004 hit a low of 13%. That's the lowest I've ever seen it, meaning of all the new households that we created, only 13% chose to go into standard apartments. Everybody else was a buyer because money was easy to get. So today, that marginal household tenure rate, well, I should back up and say, for the last few years, that marginal household tenure rate was at 60% or so. Just after the crash of, which crash? The crash of 09, we had, mathematically, it was cranking out a marginal household tenure rate of, like, I think it was 110%. And I'm going, you can't have 110% of new households. That's just not possible. And then it dawned on me, they weren't all new households. Those were people who lost their home that moved into the apartment market that was kind of skewing the numbers. So after you have a crash, a lot of the numbers like household growth, population, tend to get a little wonky. So now we're looking at only new households of 3,562, and we're using, I think we're using 55% of those will be standard apartments. If you go to the census data and you look at all rentals, you'll find that number is probably a little higher, but they're capturing people that are renting single family homes. So we're trying to get the shadow market out and look at just standard apartments. So as you can see, so that's the methodology. Employment drives net migration feeds population drives household growth, and then we got new households, and how many of those households are going into apartments. Next slide. So here on the top chart, you can see our household forecast, the marginal household tenure rates, and the metro area renter demand. So you can see for 2020, this is King Snohomish County, we're saying it's less than 2,000 units. So in January and February, when I wrote the first study, I was looking at 8,000 or 8,500. So we've gone from 8,000 to less than 2,000 in a matter of 6 months. So pretty substantial disruption. And then the rebound starts to occur in 21, apartment demand starts to bounce back up, tenure rates start to come up a little bit because net migration is expected to pick up. And whenever you get net migration, that tenure rate, marginal household tenure rate comes up. So then we start rebounding back into the 6, 7, and 8, and we're back in the 9,000s again. So it's sort of a bad news, good news kind of story. Now, where it gets a little more interesting is when we break it down by submarket. And there's been a lot of talk about household demand moving out of the core and going out to more secondary, tertiary markets. And I'll confirm that is showing up in the data. Clearly, it is showing up in the data. And if you look at Seattle here, that's the demand for Seattle. So, and Seattle means the city of Seattle plus shoreline and Lake Forest Park. And so it still has to add up to 100%. So their share is a negative 74%. That's never happened before. I have never had a share that was negative that I can ever remember. And so then you can look at the east side, where the east side is doing well. It's doing a little better than Seattle, but still in 962 units of demand, when before the disruption, it probably would have been about 2,300, 2,500. And then look at demand numbers for the south end of Snohomish. This is where we're talking about that effect of moving out to more secondary and tertiary markets. It's definitely showing up. In the south end market, during this whole disruption, vacancies went down and rents in certain submarkets went up. So the south end, and we always kind of speculate, why did the south end do that? It's either renters were seeking cheaper rents, or they were just trying to get out of Seattle and get to somewhere else. And they boosted the demand in both of those markets, to the north and the south. And then you can see things start to get back to somewhat back to normal in 21 and 22. Not exactly, look at the east side numbers in 2021, less than 2,000 still. That's going to rebound. You're reading a lot about Bellevue and Amazon and all that's going to happen. So now, and it's true, it's going to happen, but it's a matter of timing. It's going to take a little while for those offices to be built, those jobs to be created, the people to come in, to create households. It doesn't happen in a year. So the effect of all that Amazon growth in Bellevue is out there beyond 2022. I haven't done a forecast, long-term forecast yet, but I would suspect it's more like 23 and 24. Next slide, please. So this is a kind of a nice little summary. You can kind of say what's been going on here. Well, Seattle's vacancy as of June, 5.2, which was up from, I think it was about Seattle was like 4.1. Metro was like 3.7. If you look at it, the metro level, it went from 3.7 to 4.1. You kind of look at that and go, big deal, right? But it's really more the story of which submarkets, what's going on with submarkets. The other interesting thing in Seattle, not only the vacancies go up, average absorption rates went down, only 9.7, where Seattle for years was doing 15, 18. Some years they were doing 22 to 25 units a month. Now it's less than 10. But look at the numbers for the South End and Snohomish. They're actually leasing up faster than the East Side and Seattle. I can't recall ever seeing a pattern like this. So then we start looking at the supply. Well, how many units do we have that are completed and are in lease up, not leased? So these are vacant units in lease up. Metro-wide, it adds up to over 2,200 units. It's a significant number. And then you look at what's under construction, another 13,000. Proposed, there's a lot proposed. Don't get me wrong. This is only proposed that we expect will actually could be completed and impact the market within 2 years and 1 quarter. So any time that we're doing this, a proposed project would have to start almost the same quarter that we're doing the study in order to be completed in time to still hit the same time frame. Like I said, don't get me wrong, there's lots of proposed units, but they're not going to impact the market until another year or 2 after that, right? Because the time frame it takes to stretch all these out. So we look at what's the 2-year pipeline. So Seattle's got a 2-year pipeline of 9,800 units. And if you remember, its demand was negative this year. So you're probably wondering, oh, well, where's this market going, right? The east side's got a supply 4,600 and its demand was rebounded to about 2,000. So you can probably guess what's going on. Macro-wise, at the MD level, 16,000 units in the pipeline. And like I said, most of those are in lease up or under construction. So that's only 825 are the proposed that I think might be done in time. So really it's about 16,000 pretty solid units that'll be coming. And let's see what our demand numbers are out in that time period. Next slide. So this takes it a little step farther. So here's each submarket. How big is the market? What is it? Market's vacancy rate as of June. John Gordon has a question. Am I seeing a slowdown in proposed deals? Yes, there's definitely a slowdown. Not because developers are purposely pulling back, it's because lenders are pulling back. I got a lot of clients tell me how hard it is to get a loan these days. And I see it in even, I get less work for conventional banks and more work for hard money lenders. Right there, I think that tells you the story. So let's go back to the top table. Seattle, East Side, South End, Snohomish, overall vacancy 4.1. The number of vacant units due to vacancy, it just says what's 5.2% of the 219,000. 2-year demand, 2-year supply, that's the delta, oversupply in Seattle, oversupply in the East Side, little bit in the South End. Look at Snohomish, huh? Perfect. 2-year market size, and this is the vacancy rate that would be calculated based upon the math that we see here of 2 years demand and 2 years supply and a starting point of 5.2. So I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't worse. When I started doing this, I was thinking, oh, this is really going to be ugly. But by the time you plug the numbers in and we time these all out quarter by quarter when a building is going to complete and how it starts to absorb, because it doesn't affect vacancy till it absorbs. And so I would have to say it's vacancies are going up, rent growth is down, almost nil, without the effect of concessions. If you count concessions, it's in some places it's negative, of course. So my takeaway was, could have been a lot worse. This isn't too bad. And within a few years after that, we should start balancing out. There was it popped up so fast, something about, I'm talking about Seattle, but not Bellingham. I haven't done a Bellingham study for a while. This is.
She said Bellingham was booming.
It was booming, yes. But I can tell you, Bellingham was so tight. We were doing vacancy surveys up there for the last three years. We would survey over 2,000 units, and we would find 1 or 2 vacant units. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. And it was repeating itself over and over again. Bellingham was very, very tight. Clients of mine that went up there to try to develop said it was hard to find a site though. They said it was just, some of them couldn't find a site and they walked away from the market. But anyway.
Is that attributable to the university up there?
No, not, I mean, university provides a certain baseline of demand, but it's really not. They've had very steady employment growth. It's kind of one of these markets where I think the demand sort of snuck up on them. There hasn't been a lot of development, but they had constant growth. And pretty soon, one day they turned around and went, oh, the market is really tight. We were doing studies up there. We were finding people that were getting new jobs in Bellingham and could not find any housing and had to go to Anacortes to find housing. That's how tight it was. Bottom part. Now we start breaking out supply and demand and where the vacancy is going by submarket. And for Seattle, or I should say for 2020, I did the second half. So you can see our supply. We actually came up with a tiny bit of demand for Seattle in the second half. I had to look hard for that. East side, a little bit negative. South end, still a little negative. But by 2021, we've got supply metro-wide 7,300, still higher than the demand. So 2021, we still got a lot of carryover. In fact, I think the carryover has been, what's the right word, skewed? Because during the lockdown, when construction stopped, when we went back and surveyed where they were at in the construction process and timing them out, we found almost every project lost 2 to 3 months. So I didn't try quantifying it, but a fairly sizable proportion of projects that might have finished in October or November were now being pushed into the next year. So some of that supply, because of the lockdown, got pushed into 2022, pushed into 2021. So it probably helped us for this year, oddly enough, kind of that effect of the lockdown, pushing some of that supply out a little bit. So you can see vacancies climb metro-wide 4.9 to 5, and then they kind of go back to 4.8 metro-wide. But metro-wide is never really that interesting. It's always more interesting when you get into the submarkets. Seattle's going to go to about 6.2. Downtown, I've looked at it cursory. I haven't really done a complete downtown one. We're in the process of doing one now. And I think the vacancy rates downtown are currently at about 6.2, 6.3. They could go to 7%. Downtown could go to 7. But and part of it is that it's a smaller market. A lot of units in a small market. When we move out to the metro, the market's so big, it takes a lot of units to move the needle. Next slide. So here's the conclusion of all this. When we put it all together, matching our supply with our demand up by submarket, this is the forecast of where we expect vacancies to go quarter by quarter. And this represents the end of the quarter. The green line is the same pattern of supply demand. It's just changing the starting spot. And that green line was what the vacancies were in December and January. So if the market hadn't experienced the disruption in the spring, the green line is probably pretty much where we would have been, or even a little better, because vacancies usually go down from the winter to the summer. This year they went up. They normally trend down, and then vacancies rise a little bit in the fall. Again, this one here is the metro. Next slide. This is Seattle. So you can see basically for the next 2 years, the Seattle market's going to hover in the 6%, maybe hitting 6.5% or so. And, you know, it could go 6.3 to 6.7, perhaps, depending on some of the fluctuation, usually on timing of when the supply hits. Next slide, please. Here's the east side. So the east side kind of starts out pretty good and then bumps up into that mid fives. Not a big delta from winter to summer for the east side because the two different starting points weren't that far apart, 4.6 versus 4.2. So it's the same supply and demand equation. It just has a different starting point. Next slide. South End, and you'll see this for Snohomish too, are relatively stable. And this is the way they usually are because they don't have a lot of supply. And if you only have 300 units of supply or 400 or 500 units of supply, it just doesn't move the needle that much, right? It's just not a big enough number. But notice the difference. The last winter, the vacancy rate was 4.8, and by June it was 3.3. So you can see how much the demand shifted down to the South End. Again, back to that story of moving out. So South End looks pretty good. We'll have some rent growth. Next slide, please. And here's Snohomish. That's a really interesting graph, isn't it? Basically, just flat lines. There's not a lot of delta to it because there's not a lot of supply. What's not built in here, and we have to recognize the risk, is the Boeing employment numbers. If Boeing moves the 787 program to North Carolina, what I'm reading is they're talking about losing 30,000 jobs in Everett. That'll change this graph substantially. Next graph, or next slide. This is the last slide. Based on that projections, this is where I think rent growth's going to be without the effect of concessions. I'm purposely not trying to build that in. I'm just trying to look at the effect of supply and the demand. I look at concessions as sort of the shock absorber to the system. You know, the management companies try to hold the face rents. They give a month or two free rent, get you in, try to sell the unit. If you actually put in the effect of concessions, Seattle's rents for 2020 would probably be negative. I know downtown they're probably negative to 10 to 15%, and most of the new product. But the new product's not the entire market. So I would suspect if you put concessions in here, most of these places you'd be negative 5% or so on rents. And then, as the graphs illustrated, we expect a slow, modest growth in some rents, getting back up into the 2 and 3% range over the forecast period. And that's the last slide. So that's the story, and I'm sticking to it.
Brian, thank you very much. That was quite informative. That was very good. We appraisers love data and never have, it seems, enough of it. Good data, at least. So, good to know. I appreciate your time putting this together for us.
Yeah. Hope it helps.
All right, everybody, we're moving along.
Stan?
Yeah.
Would it be possible? I had a question for Brian. Do we have a moment for a question?
Yeah, I was going to suggest if anybody had questions.
Yeah. So Brian, thank you very much for all that. It was really interesting. The question I had, it seemed, if I read it right, the job losses this year were 150 some thousand. And then it looked like we get close to that back over the next 3 years. So 21, 22, 23, we gain about 149. So we're about getting those back. I'm trying to wrap my head around just getting back to where we were at the same time in the next 2 years, we're going to have additional demand for 11,800 units. And trying to wrap those two together. Could you talk about that?
Well, that's the disconnect between jobs and population growth. People are still moving here. If you look into the reasons behind why people move, you will find out there's a push and a pull factor. The pull factor is our job creation. The push factor is how bad it is where they're at. So it's sort of a relative thing. If we're only doing modestly good, but things are terrible in San Francisco or LA, relatively speaking, we're looking pretty darn good, right? So that's what happens. And population growth doesn't turn off quite as fast as jobs do. People still move here. We would probably have to be down for 1.5 to 2 years before we really seen that population numbers coming down, because people just stop coming here because they don't think there's any jobs. But we will have jobs. And of course, the tech engine is still the one that's kind of going. I think anything more than that, I mean, population is last year's population plus births minus deaths plus net migration. So it always comes down to net migration. That's the number. And I think it just reacts slower. How many people are going to leave Oregon now to come up here, being that most of the I-5 corridor just got burnt down?
Right.
You know, it's all relative, you know.
Well,
I talked to a client today about climate change, and he believes there's going to be an effect where people living in the southern states, Arizona and Texas and such, they will in a matter of years, maybe it's 10 years, but they are going to start moving north. And Seattle is one of the regions, the Northwest is one of the regions that is expected to benefit pretty good from that trend. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Brian, one more question. I know we got to move forward with the meeting. In 2010, at least nationally, there was actually a net shrinkage of household formations in America. A lot of young people moved back in with their parents, et cetera. Are we seeing any of that, and how does that affect your models, at least here in a Seattle?
Good question. I didn't go into that part of it because it can get a bit nerdy.
Yeah.
So here we go. Okay. When you go from population to households, it's average household size, right? And average household size is an extremely powerful metric. If you ever play around with that, you'll find that it's sensitive to like 6 or 7 significant decimal places. So and I did that in the model, up the average household size. So given the same number of population, but with an average household size going up slightly, you're going to have less households, and that's built into the model. I just didn't go into that level of detail.
Quick question. I realized you probably put a whole lot of time and effort into compiling your data and vetting it and curating it. And I just want to say, first of all, thank you for that attention to detail and sharing it. Curiosity. I mean, I don't work in the Seattle market, so I'm not your competition, but I'm really curious to know if you would be willing to share the slides, the PowerPoint that you presented today.
Oh, sure.
Informationally.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We usually ask our presenters if they'd allow us to post their presentations on our chapter website. And so that could be coordinated between Brian and DeAnn.
Yeah.
Right, DeAnn? Are you still there, DeAnn?
I'm still here. We'll take
All
care.
right.
Thank
Yeah.
you. And I like having that sort of reference point because a lot of people want to treat the Bellingham market like it's an extension of the Seattle market, and it really is not.
No,
And so having data about the Seattle market that's been vetted out like that to kind of hold side by side and say, yeah, not so much,
not so much.
is useful.
I'll even add to that, Pierce County is different than the Seattle market because it has a different engine of growth. And Kitsap County is different. It has a different engine of growth, just like Bellingham. To me, what makes a market cohesive is what is the economic engine behind that market. So if you're looking at job growth that's driving your demand, you can't take tech growth and kind of apply it to Kitsap County or Pierce County. It's not going to work. It's a different engine. So that's why I separate them out.
And Andy, just confirming what you said, I've read some articles recently that do point out that Bellingham is just booming. Housing prices are dramatically escalating.
Yeah.
Things are very strong. And in the Kitsap market, which is predominantly a lot of military support from the Navy and such, it's very stable and actually fairly positive in terms of rent growth and such, because there's not a lot of new development going on.
Right. That's true. Absolutely true.
Anybody else have any questions for Brian before we move on?
Stan, this is Michael Lamb. I'll ask a quick question if I can, Brian. I watch some a bit on the national level of the rental market, and one trend that I see in other markets is single-family, basically subdivision communities that are held by an entire investor and then rented out like apartments, but they're detached single-family homes. And with the increase in home prices, particularly in metro areas, that's becoming a good alternative for a lot of families. And I'm wondering if you see that in our market or anticipate in that in our market.
Great question. Home rentals have always been here. They are part of the market. They're what we've always called the shadow market. Like I said earlier, if you go into the census data, you can actually break out total rentals and how many of them are single family homes versus apartments. All of my data over the years has been focused just on the standard apartments. So the shadow market's not built in. If you built the shadow market in, I think, if you had an apartment demand number of 8,000, I bet total rental demand counting single family would probably push that number up to like 11 or 12,000. But I've never really, I've had a few assignments where they wanted to know that number, but most people building traditional apartments don't really care about that. But to really answer your question is, yes, I do expect that to happen. And where it gets even a little cloudier is in townhomes, because you can kind of go for rent or for sale on those. So if they're for rent, we count them. If they're for sale, we put them out, even if they rent them out. If somebody bought the townhome and then rented it out, it's going to show up as a single family rental.
Brian, Keith Dang posted on the chat board, maybe Brian can convert lower rents, higher vacancies, et cetera, to what will happen to apartment property values. Because it says it seems asking prices have not changed.
They haven't. Yes, you're right. And I've spoke to some brokers about what's going on in the sales. If you notice, though, the volume of sales is down over the last 6 to 7 months, and I think I think a lot of sellers are just having to be more patient right now. If you would you want to sell for, make up a number, 5 or 10% less than you believe it's worth, or just wait 3 months or 5 months, something like that. And then of course the drop in interest rates down to, incredibly historically lows might be offsetting some of that. But I think at the end of the day, marketing times are probably going to stretch out farther. But Seattle is still, it's still one of the best markets in the country. I've got clients from Southern California. They're building in LA, San Francisco, San Diego, Austin, Denver, all over. They're talking to economists in all these markets, and they come back to me and go, everybody rates Seattle as the number one or number two apartment market in the country. They said it's you and Silicon Valley. And it's because of the tech story, obviously, you know. So I don't think we're going to see a big drop off in values. I think it's just going to be people waiting it out a little bit.
Great. All right, thank you.
I have another question if there's time, and if not, I'll
Sure.
table it.
Go ahead, Andy. Thank you.
I'm curious as to, in your projections, I mean, it's kind of hard to anticipate a forecast for exactly how the COVID fallout is going to manifest. But whether you've taken into account at all what's likely to happen once the eviction moratorium is lifted in about 90 to 120 days after that. And I know we don't have hard data to work with. I know it's really difficult, but I'm just wondering whether you chose to factor something in around that, because I don't know about the Seattle market, but I'm anticipating that really nationwide, especially in the Whatcom-Scattered County marketplaces, which are my primary areas, that we're going to see some kind of fallout. It's just hard to anticipate how significant it's going to be.
Right. That's why I rely on the economist. Years ago, I used to do my own economic modeling, but oh my gosh, that took, you know, it took a month and a half just to get my employment numbers down and getting confidence. And it was taking too much time. So I started using somebody else's
But do you
economic.
know if he took that into consideration by chance? I'm just curious if that's sort of like a blind to COVID sort of projection.
I'm sure I'm sure it's factored in there somehow. I think part of the rebound in jobs that he expects to see next year and the year after is probably due to the vaccine, optimism about the vaccine coming out and things getting back to normal. Right now, though, the effect of COVID should be showing up in the vacancy rates. I talked to a property owner that owns about 6 different properties today. And he told me, he said his rent collections, he's only got out of 400 units, I think he said, 2 or 3 units that haven't paid rent. And he's kind of spread around a little bit. He was like, it's almost like normal. He didn't think there was much of an impact.
Yeah, that's interesting because I mean, I don't have those kind of numbers to work with, but sort of anecdotally, hearing, yeah, people are doing their best to pay their rent, but there's some people who can't. And of course, with the eviction moratorium, you're going to have at least a small percentage of people who are going to hold over and take advantage of that because, you know, being homeless during a pandemic is not really a viable alternative. But we're expecting a pretty good wave, at least regionally up here, of what's going to happen with the people who couldn't pay their rent, can't catch up on their rent, are holding over, and the landlords have zero recourse until the eviction moratorium is lifted. And even then, 90 to 120 days later before we see the fallout.
And
it's just interesting to consider.
Well, because of what the feds did with the stimulus money and then the extra unemployment dollars that only ended in, I think it was July. I think that cured a lot of ills through the spring and early summer. So I don't think a lot of that has shown up yet. A lot of renters probably hadn't yet struggled with that problem, but moving forward through the rest of the year, it is a concern, especially if their unemployment benefits expire and they're not extended, which they usually do during a recession. They usually extend those. So if they don't extend those and there's no more stimulus, et cetera, you may have a bigger problem than what we think. But you know, how do you factor that in exactly?
Sure. I'm just curious to see where that
Yeah.
fits.
It could happen. It's
Your
probably more of a probability thing. Like I think our forecast is probably like 80% probability or something like that. There's always that chance of something else happening that you can never see occurring or you didn't think about that'll happen. But I worry about the effect on the unemployment. If that doesn't get extended, then I think we could have some real problems.
Okay, Keith had one other final question here. Can you comment on the eviction lawsuit against the city of Seattle? Do you have any perspective on that?
No, I don't know. It's like mixing politics and economics now. I don't know. You mean like, is it a good thing or a bad thing or what the effect would be?
Probably more what the effect would be.
What the effect would be? Well, again, it ties back into, I think, the unemployment insurance. If that gets extended and continues, then people will have the money to pay their rent. We did a study for Seattle for Growth that was, the purpose of it was to go to the governor and the state government to show them what the effect was. And we drilled down to not only how many were not paying rent, but why. I mean, it's very detailed. Is it because you lost your job? Is it because of you were sick for a month? Or, what was the story? Or did you just not want to pay your rent? And there were very few that just didn't want to pay the rent. There was a few out there, but most of it was rational. It was, I'm unemployed. I haven't gotten my unemployment check yet. That was actually part of it. The problem with the unemployment check showed up in the data, but they weren't huge numbers. I mean, and then we multiplied it out proportionally to the whole market, so it added up to a lot of what the potential rent loss could be. But it wasn't as dire as I think people might have thought it was going to be. Could get worse, though.
All right. I appreciate it again. Thank you, Brian. I'd like to kind of move on now so this doesn't go the rest of the night. I do want to take a few moments to acknowledge some of the members of the chapter who have received designations. We used to present certificates for designations at our chapter dinner meetings, and we haven't been able to do that this year. Since the end of last year, when we had our November meeting, there have been 4 designations awarded. Susan Long received her AIRRS designation. Linda Stewart, who I believe is on tonight, received her SRA designation. Linda, you want to say anything real quick to add a note to that? If she's on still. Her microphone is not working. Okay. Well, congrats, Linda. Way to go. Christopher Paulson received his MAI designation, the only member so far this year to be awarded the MAI designation. And Linda says thank you to everybody. You're welcome, Linda. And then Rich Archivalletta received his AIGRS designation. So we've had one of each of the 4 different AI designations awarded this year, chapter members so far. I'd like to continue to encourage those who are working on a designation to keep moving forward on that. And congratulations again from chapter membership. Update from me on chapter activities and things, and also kind of combine and roll in our fall conference on that. We are going to try to have a virtual quasi fall conference this year, next month. You should be seeing notices about that. We are having a little bit of some challenge. While Scott Beethan and Mitch Olson, who I want to acknowledge, I see they're not on right now. We want to acknowledge the effort and the time that they put in to putting everything together for this virtual fall conference presentation, line up the speakers and such. We're now finding that there's some hiccups in the overall registration process of doing it online through national, because everything now has to go through national. All the registration monies, if you want to contribute, even though we're not charging anything for this fall conference, if you want to register and sign up as a sponsor or as a friend of the conference, it all has to go through national. And national's got a real funky, weird way of having of how you have to register. If you initially try to register and sign up, and you see something down below that says it's going to charge you $1,600 to do so, ignore that. Don't worry about it. Just keep going through the registration process and put in your code that you should see on the registration links for if you're a member of the chapter, or if you want to be a sponsor or a friend of the conference, and it should charge you only the amount for the sponsorship or the friend of the conference. Friend of the conference is $75, different levels of sponsorship. Or if you aren't either a friend or a sponsor and you want to just register, just go ahead and register, and it will charge you nothing. But you have to put in your discount code for your applicable level, and get registered and signed up. I'd like to encourage everybody to participate for that day. It's from 10 to 11:30 in the morning and from 2 to 3:30 in the afternoon. Unfortunately, there is no CE with the state for licensing available for this year, just because of what they were requiring and the time we had to try to set this up. So hopefully, if things continue in this manner and we're not able to hold a live conference next year, I think we'll be in a position where we can arrange for some state CE for that. But hopefully things will be back to a little bit more normal. We can hold an actual live fall conference next. Otherwise, the board just met today. We approved our budget for next year. No increase in dues. We are going to work to provide more online seminars, homegrown seminars, and CE throughout the year. We're going to do our best to provide one seminar or CE course every month through 2021, and hopefully then being able to give everybody a member benefit with no charge for the homegrown seminars. There would only be a reasonable nominal charge on the CE courses that are presented. Thank you. We do have a course coming up that right now is scheduled for Tuesday, October 20th, the Extreme Appraising. The date, right now, we're going to hopefully be able to hold to that date, but it may change either a little later in October or first week of November. We're still waiting to get our approval for the CE for this from the Department of Licensing, and hopefully they'll come through and get us on board here very soon so we can start the registration process. We can't actually get everybody to register because, again, registration has to go through national. National won't set up registration until the DOL says they've approved it for CE. So there you go. So anyway, working on all that. DeAnn, can you remember anything else from today's meeting of the board or anything we've talked about that I should make sure I mention to members?
We're going to send out an announcement on looking for nominations for Appraiser of the Year and Associate of the Year.
Yeah, keep an eye out for that. We want everybody to think about that and provide some nominations. Oh, and I do, while I'm thinking about it now, I realize I want to introduce everybody to DeAnn Hartman of Hartman Management, and she is our new executive director for the chapter. effective, started as of May 1st this year.
Yes.
And she's been very helpful in keeping us going in the direction we need to go. As always, there's a little bit of a learning curve and a little bit of a bump here and a few bumps there, minor ones though, trying to get everything coordinated and figured out. But we're comfortable and confident that our future is going to look good and strong under DeAnn's help with running the chapter. So welcome aboard, DeAnn.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. And I'm happy to put faces with a lot of names. So this was great.
Good. I wish more people would actually have cameras set up so we could see more faces. All right. Let's see. I guess that's pretty much about it. Unless anybody has any new business they want to present to the chapter. Anybody have anything they need to present or offer?
Stan, there was a question from Andrew about the extreme appraising and whether that's going to be free. No, that's not a free training because there is going to be CE with it. And I'm thinking
And we have
it's
to pay the instructor.
195. Andrew, I'll send something to you. I think it's 195, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
I think that's about right for members. That or in the range of that to 225 or so. These kind of seminars, we're trying to keep it below 250. And we're actually trying to provide as much of a member benefit, give back to members because of being unable to do a lot of things this last year.
My staff is telling me it is 195. So.
Great. Thank you. Okay, anything else? Otherwise, we're about 11 minutes past when I thought we would end. Oh, hey, here's a question. Field process applications for license exams. Andrew has a really bad experience with that. It took you about, what, 6 months or 7 months, Andrew?
I turned in all my paperwork late April for my certified general, and I took my test September 3rd.
Now, I'm hoping that that was an anomaly and that DOL has now got their act together and it's going to take less time than what that experience was. I know they've had issues with their system. They're trying to get their system up to date, running better. It's a new system, and there's hiccups. They've also had issues because of the COVID virus, and also having downtime that was demanded, required by the state. So anyway, hopefully they'll get it together. But yeah, reserve a buffer time for yourselves if you can do it. At least probably maybe 3 or 4 months you might need, unfortunately. And I'm going to be talking to DOL about how things are progressing, if at all better, hopefully better, and I'm moving forward in the right direction.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I got my approval to take my exam in July, but the earliest date was September. So they're
part of that, I understand, is outside DOL. It also has to do with the exam companies that are offering the exams and proctoring them, doing it because of the COVID virus.
Yep.
Everybody's been impacted by that this year. And it's a new reality everybody's had to adjust to, so it's kind of fouled up the typical business models and timing. Okay, everybody, I appreciate it. Do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting tonight in a second?
So moved.
Mel Morgan moved to adjourn. Do we have a second? Michael seconded. All right. I'm assumed by acclamation, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. And we'll see you hopefully back in November, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Thanks very much, Brian.
Yeah, great job, Brian. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.